If you take a look at the soundtracks of all the Persona games, especially from 3 and beyond, they seem to have a distinct Persona sound. This is despite the vast difference in style and mood, and even genre between many of these songs and games. But what is it about these soundtracks that makes them sound so similar? Well, my intuition is to say maybe it's a musical genre like jazz for instance, but after taking a closer look, it seems like that's not the case at all. In fact, I'd argue that none of these games have jazz soundtracks, not even this one. Yeah, I said it. As a musician who just so happens to have a YouTube channel about anime, I thought what not a better video to make than one exploring that Persona sound. I love this franchise, and to me, there's no better music for flirting with virtual high school girls. Persona counts as anime, by the way, because I say so. Alright, it's time for a quick backstory on the first 2 Persona games. So, the Persona games were originally a spin-off to another series called Shin Megami Tensei, which of course comes from Megami Tensei, which comes from a sci-fi book called Digital Devil Story. After the release of Shin Megami Tensei Persona, or I guess you could call it Persona 1, we got Persona 2, which had 2 entries, Innocent Sin and Eternal Punishment. In other words, Persona 2 Eternal Punishment is not to be confused with Persona 3, that's a whole different thing. Fun fact, in Persona 2 Innocent Sin, Adolf Hitler was one of the main antagonists. And yeah, that's Personas 1 and 2. While the first 2 Persona games, laid out the foundation for the series, they seem a bit half-baked when you compare them to other iterations. It was Persona 3 that shaped the franchise into what it is today. Not only did it benefit from the improved graphical capabilities of the PlayStation 2, but it also introduced the series-defining concept of balancing your daily student life with intense dungeon crawling. This leap forward for the series is reflected in the game's music. Persona 3's soundtrack naturally has a more modern and laid-back feeling at times to account for that life simulation aspect of the game. We see this in songs like Iwatodai Dorm, which is one of my favorites. But that's not to say that the game's music doesn't also reflect its dark existential themes of death and mortality. As it relates to the overarching question of this video, I think the main genres you see here are pop and hip-hop. You also definitely see some jazz elements here, even heavily in some songs. With that being said though, there are a lot of songs in this soundtrack that stray away from all 3 of these genres. You get some classical, whatever this was. Yet it still seems to have that Persona sound, and I can't figure it out, man. I don't know. Let's take a look at the next game. Persona 4 released in 2008, 2 years after its predecessor, and again we see a pretty good jump up in the graphical department. It also feels a bit more refined than Persona 3 in pretty much all aspects. Although it still has dark themes, Persona 4 is a bit more joyful and optimistic in its presentation. This is, again, of course, represented in the music. As with Persona 3, there's a lot of fluctuation still. Some of these songs even have fluctuating genres within them. Overall though, in terms of genre, I think Persona 4 has a bit more of a focus on J-pop. What the hell is going on here, man? Alright, so Persona 5. This was my introduction to the series, and it will always have a very special place in my heart. That being said, I think Persona 5 has the sexiest soundtrack of probably any video game ever. Persona 5 was released a substantial 8 years after its predecessor, and it's very noticeable. It had a newfound maturity and swagger to it, as if it really knew what it was by this point. We see this through the game's considerable graphical improvements, as well as the extremely stylized nature of everything, especially the menus, and of course, through the amazing soundtrack. The soundtrack has a very distinct acid jazz kind of flavor to it. For those of you who don't know, acid jazz is kind of a mix between jazz, funk, and electronic music. In my opinion, it's its own thing. It's not really technically jazz. By the way, if you like Persona 5's music, you'll probably also like Jamiroquai. Of all the entries we've talked about so far, Persona 5's soundtrack is definitely the most consistent throughout. But if this is the first game within the series that has more of a universal sound, why is it that all these soundtracks still kind of sound similar? The answer is Shoji Meguro. This dude's a fucking beast. Shoji Meguro has been the lead composer for all the mainline Persona games so far, and he's always seemed to take interest in a variety of different genres, from J-pop to classical to, of course, jazz. This love for a bunch of different musical genres shines through in his work. Persona's music doesn't really have one specific genre, it's all over the place. But that still leaves the question. How can he blend all these genres together and still have that distinct Persona sound? Well, There's a few reasons. Of course, a lot of the instrumentation is going to be the same throughout the games, and it would make sense if he carried on some motifs, whether that be intentional or maybe subconscious. You also have to take into account that Meguro does have his own distinct style. But I have my own little theory on this. What I think is that Shoji Meguro has an uncanny talent for conveying feeling through his music. If you beat Persona 5 and didn't at least shed a tear at the final credits song, dude, we're not friends, I don't think. Make sure to comment below your favorite virtual girlfriend. Look, my point here is that Shoji Meguro is a genius. All of these games, although vastly different at times, are still in the same franchise. Therefore, they carry along some of the same themes and emotions with them. They often cover complex topics like finding your true self, what even is your true self, and live in the moment and all that stuff. The reason for the quote-unquote persona sound is because Meguro has mastered tapping into these feelings. And you know what? I'll leave you with this. Throughout this video, I've mentioned jazz quite a bit. It's in the thumbnail, and I talked about how even Persona 5 isn't technically jazz. I do stand with that claim. I think that today the term jazz has become synonymous with just complex. You play 1/7 chord and people go crazy. But you want to know something about the original jazz? It came from New Orleans. It was created by black musicians who blended intricate African rhythms with rich European and Western harmonies. They broke the rules, per se, and created something entirely new. And, you know, it took people getting used to. These musicians were even scrutinized at points, but they didn't care. That's not what jazz was about. To them, jazz felt good, and it sounded good. It was about freedom. In a way, I think that Shoji Meguro, through Persona's music, kind of carries on that spirit of jazz, and I think that's pretty beautiful. But art is dead now, and it's all going to be replaced by AI, so, you know, make sure to like and subscribe. I'm gonna go to bed.